The next topic we're going to talk about is the return of conservative economics. You ready to jump into the deep end here of a bit of history to
Absolutely.
yeah give a little perspective. This is something that we really want to do. Um, I have the tab selected here. If you could show it, there's a quote that I really want to highlight from this article. This was in National Review, which is a very conservative news magazine. They were very critical of Donald Trump. In fact, they ran an entire issue criticizing Donald Trump in the run up to the election, and that, of course, did absolutely nothing. If anything, it made people more likely to vote for him because they said, "Hey, these guys are the establishment, and if they hate him, we should like him." And so it's a little bit ironic that National Review is publishing this article, "The Return of Conservative Economics." It's written by somebody named Orrin Cass, if that name rings a bell. I feel like I know the name, but I wonder if it's not because of Cass Sunstein. Um, but the gist of the article, it's something that is very Trump friendly, which is Trump had this message, essentially that our economic system is flawed because we're favoring business, but we're forgetting the workers. Workers are getting left behind. And there was a lot of people, that was true, right? That was absolutely true. There were a lot of people in the Rust Belt where there are no jobs, the economy's terrible, those jobs aren't coming back. People in coal country, we're attacking the coal industry, and it was time that somebody in the White House stood up for them. And you have to hand it to President Trump. He absolutely has done that. He has put in place tariffs. Whether those are, and well, that's a nuanced issue. I don't want to dig too deep into what Trump is doing. There's a bit more there than the news is telling us. But I wanted to share this quote because this is what I think National Review was concerned about in 2016 when Trump was 2015 and 16 when Trump was running, was that these ideas would be smuggled in under the guise of helping workers, of being worker first, America first. I like America first. I like worker first. I want wages to go up. I want there to be more jobs. I want there to be better jobs. I love that. Okay. We should all love that as Americans. That's what America winning looks like. But this quote is terrifying. It says, "We have become defenders." This is Senator Marco Rubio. So this is not just some guy with a website or a blog. This is a U.S. senator, and he's not alone. You can see Josh Hawley is also quoted here in the same paragraph. So this is a movement that might have some legs and might affect your liberty going forward. So Senator Marco Rubio says, "We have become defenders of the right of businesses to make a profit, the right of shareholders to receive a return on their investment, and the obligation people have to work. But we have neglected the rights of workers to share in the benefits they create for their employer, and the obligation of businesses to act in the best interest of the workers and the country that have made their success possible." Do I even have to say what's wrong with this sentence? I do, because it's not obvious. The rights of workers to share in the benefits they create for their employer. If you're a worker, you're not a shareholder. You're not entitled to a portion of the company that you work for. You're paid wages. You're paid a salary. Now, this business about acting in the best interest of the workers, you shouldn't endanger your workers. You should treat them like human beings. I think that goes without saying. Workers absolutely do have rights, and if you treat them like animals, don't be surprised when there's a revolution. But this business that they have a right to share in the benefits they create, that's right out of Karl Marx. Absolutely right out of Karl Marx. This is his theory of the exploitation of labor. The idea that the workers are the ones who create all of the wealth and the people at the top are just parasites. And to see a Republican senator, especially, you know what? I'm a little hesitant to even bring this up, but he's Cuban American. He should know this is what communism looks like. This is what communism sounds like. It sounds like you're just looking out for the rights of the workers. Yes, workers have rights. They are human beings. They deserve dignity. We should when we have to make choices about economic policy, we should always err on the side of better wages, a better economy, better jobs. But this business of the right to share in the benefits they create for their employer, that is a Trojan horse, absolutely a Trojan horse. And then the last part, the obligation to act in the best interest of the country that has made their success possible. Oh boy, what does he mean by that? That could mean a lot of things, couldn't it? What does it mean to be a patriotic company? Does it mean you don't do business with the Chinese? Does it mean you don't buy Chinese telecommunications equipment? What does it mean? Does it mean that you never open a factory in China, or that you perform some kind of a balancing act where the benefit to the United? How are we measuring this? This is, like I said, it's a Trojan horse. This is how Marxism or something like it comes to the United States, dressed up in the American flag, dressed up in patriotism and conservatism. It's called the return of conservative economics, but there's absolutely anything but. And this is what we were worried about when Trump became president. I don't think this is what Trump has stood for as president. I'm not going to hang this on Trump's head or blame the president, because this is not him speaking. He can speak for himself. He has not advocated anything like this, but this is terrifying. What do you think, Eric?
Well, it's kind of hard to react to, because again, you kind of hit the nail on the head. It's like, what does he mean exactly by this? These are very kind of open-ended quotes that are subject to a lot of interpretation, and that's the thing that is troubling with that kind of rhetoric. It can be taken a lot of different ways. So ultimately, you have to look at what is the policy that he's actually advocating. What's the underlying policy that they want to change? What is this return to conservative economics? What even is conservative economics, at least defined by these people?
Right. Well, it says here, unlike the prevailing orthodoxy, conservative economics will take seriously the effects of social and market forces on each other. It will concern itself with the pernicious effects that high levels of economic inequality can have on the social fabric, the market's functioning, and people's well-being, regardless of absolute material living standards. So do you remember Thomas Piketty's big book, Capital, a few years ago? He was the, I believe, French economist who was talking about inequality and how inequality was growing, and that was this terrible thing. This is Thomas Piketty, who was, of course, he named his book Capital as a reference to Karl Marx's Das Kapital. This is Marxism. It sounds conservative because it's cloaked in concern for the worker and concern for the nation, whereas, of course, Marxism is internationalist, globalist typically. But make no mistake, this economic program is Marxist in nature, because you can't define any of these terms. Whenever you try to nail these people, whether it's Marco Rubio or Rick Santorum, and it's not a coincidence that both those guys are very conservative Catholics, very devout. I'm Catholic myself. There's no problem with Catholicism, but this is an idea that has come out of certain think tanks associated with the conservative right. Just like the neoconservative right is associated with Jewish conservatives. Thinkers like Irving Kristol and Bill Kristol. This is an idea that is associated with Catholic conservatives, and it's very pernicious because it sounds so appealing, it sounds so moral, but it's the fact that these terms can't be defined. It's always a bunch of slogans in search of actual policy. This idea of social and market forces acting upon each other. How do you measure that? Where are the limits on what government can do when you start trying to judge the social impact of economic policies? And when you start talking about economic inequality, America doesn't have a problem with economic inequality for the most part. And the fact that people are trying to ramp up anger over this says that we don't have enough to be angry about because we have done such a good job of reducing poverty, of reducing homelessness in America, that all people can say is, well, yeah, sure, wages are going up and the working man has never had it better, but Bill Gates has it better, Jeff Bezos has it better, so maybe you should be upset about that.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of this rhetoric really reminds me of fascism, honestly. And the sort of, we've talked about this off the air. I'm very much an advocate that the whole right left, the traditional political ideological spectrum that's taught in college, and I was taught this in college, of the extreme right being fascism and the extreme left being communism is a farce. Because to me, it looks more like a circle, and they start to look almost exactly like each other. You can, my background, I'm half Estonian, and Estonians weren't prospering necessarily any better under Hitler than they were under the communists. It's true that they had some benefits racially because if anything, the Nazis were a little bit more sympathetic to them because of who they were, because Estonians are not considered Slavic. That kind of gets into the specifics of that situation. But in terms of what life was like under either regime, there was no freedom. That's the bottom line. There was no liberty. That's the bottom line. It's just a different term. The actual effect is the same. We've also talked off the air that's, classic fascism in terms of like Mussolini was a little different than what Hitler did because, in terms of Mussolini nationalized, I think, like 75% of the economy. He was just about as communist as you could get in that regard. Whereas, of course, Hitler.
And he had been a Socialist Party official before becoming the father of fascism, so that's not a surprise.
Hitler's difference economically was that he did not, quote unquote, nationalize, large sections of the economy. That's not because that wasn't part of the ideology of the National Socialist Party, because in fact, the brown shirts were advocates of that. That's why they were eliminated. It was because that's what they wanted. They wanted to nationalize the industries and said things like the revolution is only halfway done. That's why they were eliminated. But what Hitler realized, of course, was that he didn't really need to nationalize these companies because he could bring these he could bring the owners of these companies, the chairman of the board, into a room and put a gun to his head and tell him what to do. And so it was the same effect without having to actually nationalize these companies. That's my point. Is just because you don't do that doesn't mean that you're not in control, and it doesn't mean that we're talking about a situation where we have freedom. It's still tyranny, and that's why I say the right left, the traditional spectrum that people are taught in college is just complete garbage. And I think a lot of what you're talking about, that's where you kind of get this idea that this is a conservative, this is a right wing kind of economic theory. It's like the same way that fascism is,
Right. And let's not get carried away here. I mean, Marco Rubio isn't advocating gas chambers. He isn't advocating a police state in the model of Castro or Franco or anybody like that. But this is how it begins, because you try to exert a little bit of control, thinking you're going to be able to get these positive results for the economy, and then it doesn't quite work. So you need a little bit more control. And if you control the economy, you control people. If there's no economic liberty, there's no personal liberty. And that was the
people are often able to separate the idea of socialism versus communism. That's one of the reasons, like Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist, because the idea there is that the government can still, quote unquote, be free and democratic, while the economy can be managed by the state. And there are examples of this. I mean, even if we look north and south, Canada and Mexico both have a lot more elements of socialism than the United States does. And they are still considered democracies. Now, what you don't hear very often is the fascist version of that, because the fascist economic model is not talked about very much, and that's the problem there. Reagan talked about this. He always said that he always thought fascism would not come from the right; it would come from the left, because liberalism advocates this high degree of regulation, and therefore, he was looking at that Hitler model, that he was saying, hey, you don't have to nationalize these companies, you can just regulate them to death and basically take them over in that way. So I think it's a very under-discussed element of fascism is the way fascist economies work and what they actually did. And that's what I'm talking about here. So we may not get the gas chambers, because there's no gas chambers in Mexico or Canada. I'm not trying to say that. But what I am trying to say is, whereas people can separate the ideas of communism and socialism quite well, they do not generally look at the way fascist economies are run and then look at their own system and say, we're doing that. Exactly. That's exactly what we're doing. We're doing exactly the same thing that Mussolini did economically. The trains are running on time. You know what I mean? Or we're doing exactly the same thing that Hitler did.
I think you just hit on something really important. We have terms. We have the term progressive and socialist and communist, and we can put those on a spectrum of being left to further left. And we can understand that a progressive is not a socialist, and a socialist is not a communist. But we don't have similar words to describe the progression towards fascism, perhaps in large part because fascism was imposed so quickly in Italy. It happened almost overnight, and the same thing in Germany happened almost overnight. There is no revolutionary process. There's no gradations, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen slowly somewhere else.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Is that what you're getting at?
No, well, the thing that I'm also trying to get at is, well, for instance, a communist is a socialist, but a socialist is not, by definition, a communist. You see what I'm saying?
Okay.
Because what we do is we separate socialism as an economic theory, whereas communism is not just economic; it's also has to do with the way that you run your government. There's no question that any communist government that's actually existed on this planet, they've all been totalitarian. Essentially they become an oligarchy where the party is in charge, and the party never represents more than maybe 2 or 3% of the population. So they essentially become an oligarchy. That's just the way it is. And so we can make a distinction there. And like I said, you have countries, just right to the north and south of us, that are much more socialist and openly so, but they're not considered totalitarian per se. I would not advocate certainly that Canada is a totalitarian state, but when it comes to the way that the economic model of most fascists, which can be described in a lot of different ways. For instance, I've heard Hitler's economic plan described as military Keynesianism. And if you look at a lot of Keynesianism and Keynesian thought, it's often tied in practical terms to military spending, because that's the way that you can get a government to spend the massive amounts of money that you need to make quote unquote Keynesianism work. So because you have to spend a massive amount of money, and so the issue there is how is that sustainable? And my conclusion is it's not. It's completely not sustainable. You can't do that. That's the flaw with that model. But it's what Hitler did to get his country out of the Depression and get his country to basically full employment. He went on a massive government spending program. That's what he did. And so, but people don't really look at that, and they don't look at the fact that there are many countries, including our own in some ways, and our own country at that time with the New Deal, I would argue, that was following that model. That's exactly the model they were following. They were trying to spend us out of the Depression. That's the entire basis of Keynesianism. And when you look at what Hitler did, that is what he did. He went on a massive government spending program, and that's how he was able to get basically full employment long before the United States was out of the Depression.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to show one more thing from this article before we wrap this up. This is mind-boggling. If you want to know why this could have legs on the right, why we could see fascism come from the right, not from the left, as you were saying Reagan predicted. This system, conservative economics, so to speak, which is it's a repackaging of Marxism, it will consider the benefits that locally owned establishments bring to their communities alongside the benefits that hyper-efficient conglomerates can deliver. So less economic efficiency, less economic output, but that the fact that it's locally made, locally sourced. I mean, you could just hear the granola crunching there. Absolutely, that is your typical socialist local source nonsense. But it says we're insisting on recognizing the importance of non-market labor performed within the household and community, rather than assuming that the higher monetary incomes in a society of two earner families must indicate progress. So that I have to say, I find that a little bit compelling. The fact that a mother raising her children may not have an immediate tangible payoff, but maybe an investment in the community in the future. Yeah. My concern is, what exactly are we doing here? Are we going to try to lump this into GDP somehow? I really worry when you start with, we're going to give workers part ownership of businesses, and you end with we need to value mothers. It sounds a bit like the feminist Marxist critique, the exploitation of women, that men go out and work, but they couldn't work unless women were at home. This isn't exactly the same thing. This is a bit more conservative. This is a bit more. The goal here is family unity. That you promote the nuclear family, you promote the traditional family, but you can absolutely see how that would have appeal to the right, to the Pat Buchanan right, and with Donald Trump in the White House, don't think that this doesn't have a chance of being something really big. It absolutely could be huge, and this is just the first shot being fired.
I'd be curious to see, particularly with Marco Rubio, if he implements, he comes forward with some sort of a proposal, a bill, what's the policy? That's what I'm really interested in, is how do you implement this? What is the way that you make this happen? I'll give you a sort of a liberty argument of workers of the world unite, because I've thought about this a lot. I was in a union most of my career, actually all of my career. In fact, I was in two unions most of my career, but I was in one union at least my entire public safety career. Granted, public sector unions are a little different than private sector, especially in a place like Arizona, which is a right-to-work state. When you're in you have a government job, the unions are a lot more powerful, even in a right-to-work state, than they are on the private sector. Nevertheless, there are unions and private unions in Arizona. And one of the things that I've always wondered with the private unions is why, especially when you're dealing with a large corporation that's publicly traded, why don't they use their union money to buy out the business? Why don't they buy shares of their own business that they work for? Because there are such things as worker-owned businesses. They do exist in the private sector.
That may not always be possible. It
Why? But why don't unions do this? Why don't unions basically take over controlling shares of the companies that they work for? In many cases, they could. They have the money to do it.
In many
They don't
cases,
do it.
yeah.
I'm sorry, Peter. I didn't hear your answer.
In many cases, yes. Although, not surprisingly, Bernie Sanders has something on his website talking about this, that he wants to tax businesses where there's a big disparity between the wages of the executives and the wages of the workers. So that's how you prevent that inequality from happening, at least according to Bernie. And if you want to know how these people are going to keep businesses local, well, you start taxing businesses that are interstate at a higher rate. So that way you encourage people to be just like with tariffs, you essentially have internal tariffs to encourage more local businesses. That's how this would happen. And I know this because what Marco Rubio is advocating, it goes under a different name, distributism, which maybe is a nicer name than fascism. But it's this idea that things should be local, that the economy should be more distributed. It was an idea promoted by the Catholic author G.K. Chesterton, who wrote a bunch of great books. But I like Orthodoxy, The Everlasting Band, so many. He wrote a bunch of detective novels as well. But his economic philosophy, distributism, is a bunch of mush, just like this article is, and it's very hard to put into practice. But when it is put into practice, it's a bunch of economic controls to discourage people from trading across borders, across state lines, and so on. It tries to encourage more local autarky, more local self-sufficiency from an economic perspective, primarily through taxes.
Yeah, and I would argue that's just another form of crony capitalism, because I'm not an advocate of the way it's done the other way around, because it is done the other way around all the time.
Sure.
You always see communities, for instance, giving Walmart tax breaks to open up a new store. That's, to me, classic crony capitalism. What you're talking about is just crony capitalism with the shoe on the other foot. Instead of advocating for these large corporations, you advocate for these smaller ones through tax incentives, or basically not taxing them. Which that's what a tax incentive generally is. It's some sort of tax credit or tax deferment or something like that. But again, I do want to get back to what I was saying earlier in terms of there is a free market answer to this question that they're to this issue that they're talking about. And again, I would say, why don't private sector unions organize their workers and organize their funds to buy large shares of the companies that they work for and essentially become a worker-owned company? Why isn't that their goal? Why don't they do that? And that's a real question that I think is it's not just meant to be rhetorical, because there's an answer, but what is it? Because it would seem to me that would be the answer. Instead of trying to get the government to give you additional regulations that quote unquote improve your stock, which is things like the minimum wage, overtime. We could go through all sorts of different reforms that are supposedly meant to help workers, and they're government imposed reforms. Mm-hmm. But from a pure free market standpoint, you could use unions to take over these companies in a legitimate way. From a free market standpoint, just have your workers buy stock, have them pool their resources together to buy stock in the company they work for. Get a controlling interest. Now your president of your union is on the board. You see what I'm saying? Right. Why don't they do this? Because they could, they just don't. And the reason, I think, is because of agenda. So I just want to kind of throw that out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like we could go a lot of different directions with the topic, and I'm sure that we will in the coming weeks and months. We haven't talked much about the example of Spain and Portugal, because those were fascist dictatorships that lasted well into the late 20th century, far past Italy and Germany, and yet we just pretend they never existed. They were just part of the free world. They were on our team. They weren't. But I don't see that we have enough time to get into that tonight. So maybe a different time.